Nobody expected this after the first race of the season. But just before the Chinese Grand Prix, Red Bull may have revealed something that could change the entire championship. Because hidden inside the RB22 are aerodynamic upgrades that rival engineers are already calling almost impossible to copy. Not because they are large, but because of how they work. After Australia, the paddock believed Red Bull had problems. Tire degradation. A fragile new Red Bull Ford power unit. A car that looked incredibly fast for a few laps, but unstable across a full race distance. It looked like the start of a difficult season. But then something strange began appearing on the RB22 before China. Subtle floor changes. New airflow behavior around the rear of the car. And a pattern of aerodynamic details that suddenly made engineers from rival teams look twice. Because when they connected the dots, the conclusion was shocking. Red Bull may not have been fixing the RB22. They may have been unlocking it. And if the new aerodynamic system works the way Red Bull expects, the car that struggled with tire temperatures in Australia might suddenly become one of the most stable and efficient machines on the grid. Which leads to a terrifying possibility for the rest of Formula One. What if the RB22 was never slow? What if it was simply waiting for this upgrade? Because once you understand what Red Bull has actually changed underneath the car, you begin to see why some engineers believe the concept behind the RB22 could take months for other teams to replicate. So before we break down the hidden aerodynamic system, the floor design that shocked the paddock, and the reason these upgrades appeared right before the Chinese Grand Prix, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because the real story behind the RB22 might be far bigger than anyone expected. Right after the Australian Grand Prix, the mood inside the Red Bull garage was not what most people expected. From the outside, the RB22 looked competitive. In certain moments of the race weekend, Max Verstappen was able to extract impressive lap times, and the car showed flashes of the aerodynamic strength that had defined Red Bull's previous championship machines. But when the engineers returned to the factory and began analyzing the telemetry, the data revealed something deeply unusual. The RB22 was producing enormous aerodynamic load. Sometimes even more than the simulations predicted. At first, that sounded like incredible news. More downforce normally means more grip, and more grip usually translates into faster lap times. But the problem was not the amount of downforce. The problem was how that downforce behaved. During certain phases of the lap, especially in long medium-speed corners, the aerodynamic balance of the car shifted slightly toward the rear. It was not dramatic enough to cause an obvious handling problem. Fans watching the race would never notice it. But for a Formula One driver, even the smallest imbalance changes everything. Because when the rear of the car gains slightly more aerodynamic load, the front tires suddenly have to work harder to maintain the car's direction through the middle of the corner. That is when drivers begin making tiny steering corrections. Those corrections might look invisible from the outside, but they generate heat. And when those corrections happen repeatedly over an entire race stint, the rear tires slowly climb toward their thermal limit. Once that limit is crossed, traction begins to disappear. The driver must correct the car even more. And the performance begins to fall away. That exact pattern is what Red Bull engineers identified in the data from Australia. But at the same time, another issue appeared that made the situation even more complicated. The Red Bull Ford power unit experienced a dramatic failure during the opening race weekend, raising immediate questions about how aggressively the engine had been integrated into the RB22 chassis. This engine is the first full expression of the Red Bull and Ford technical partnership under the new 2026 regulations. And unlike previous generations, the hybrid system now plays a much larger role in the car's overall performance. Electrical energy deployment is no longer just an additional boost. It is a core part of the acceleration strategy. That means the power unit, the hybrid system, and the aerodynamic platform of the car must all work together perfectly. If one of those systems behaves slightly differently than expected, the balance of the entire machine begins to change. After studying the data from Melbourne, Red Bull engineers began to realize something extremely important. The RB22 might not have a fundamental weakness. It might simply be operating inside an incredibly narrow performance window. A window where everything works perfectly when the balance is correct. But where even the smallest disturbance creates tire degradation, thermal stress, and unpredictable behavior. That discovery changed the entire development direction of the car before the Chinese Grand Prix. Instead of chasing more downforce or more power, Red Bull engineers began focusing on something much more valuable. Stability. Stability of the airflow under the floor. Stability of the cooling system around the engine. Stability of the aerodynamic balance as the car transitions between corners and straights. And that focus led directly to the upgrade pattern that engineers began noticing on the RB22 before Shanghai. Because once you understand what Red Bull was trying to stabilize, the small aerodynamic changes suddenly reveal a much bigger strategy. A strategy that could explain why rival teams are already saying this concept might take months to replicate. And this is where the RB22 story becomes even more fascinating. Because when rival engineers started analyzing the upgrade patterns on the car in Shanghai, they realized something that changed the entire interpretation of Red Bull's design. These upgrades were not just about producing more downforce. They were about controlling when and how that downforce appears. That might sound like a small detail, but in modern Formula One, it can decide whether a car dominates or struggles. The reason is simple. A Formula One car is never in the same aerodynamic state for more than a few seconds. As the driver moves through a lap, the car constantly changes attitude. Braking, turning, accelerating. Ride height changes. Airflow direction shifts. And the aerodynamic surfaces must remain stable through every one of those phases. If the airflow under the floor becomes unstable during any of those transitions, the entire balance of the car shifts. That shift forces the driver to make corrections. And those corrections destroy tire performance. After Australia, Red Bull engineers realized the RB22 might be producing incredible downforce, but the delivery of that downforce was not perfectly consistent during transitions. Especially during one very specific moment. Corner exit. This is the most violent phase of the lap for a Formula One car. The driver begins applying full throttle. The hybrid system releases electrical energy. The aerodynamic system prepares to switch from high downforce mode to low drag mode. And all of that happens in just a few seconds. If the airflow underneath the car becomes unstable at that exact moment, the rear tires suddenly receive a spike of load. That spike creates heat. And heat destroys tire grip. Which is why the upgrades appearing before the Chinese Grand Prix focus so heavily on the floor edges and the airflow structures surrounding the rear of the car. These areas control how air enters the Venturi tunnels underneath the chassis. They also control how the airflow remains attached when the car changes ride height during acceleration. If Red Bull stabilizes that airflow, the downforce becomes smoother. Instead of arriving suddenly, it builds progressively. That single change can completely transform how the car behaves on corner exit. The driver applies throttle earlier. The rear tires remain inside their temperature window. And the aerodynamic platform becomes predictable. But the RB22 contains another element that makes this concept extremely difficult for rivals to copy. The interaction between the floor and the cooling system. Because the Red Bull Ford power unit is packaged extremely tightly inside the chassis. The cooling outlets around the engine cover are carefully designed to release hot air in very specific directions. That hot air does not simply escape into the atmosphere. It interacts with the airflow traveling toward the rear wing and diffuser. Which means the cooling system itself becomes part of the aerodynamic system. If a rival team tried to replicate the RB22 floor without matching that exact cooling airflow pattern, the entire aerodynamic balance would change. That is why engineers inside the paddock are calling this concept so difficult to copy. It is not a single upgrade. It is an entire ecosystem of airflow. The floor. The cooling outlets, the rear suspension airflow, the active aerodynamic system. Every one of those elements interacts with the others. And when they work together correctly, the result is something incredibly powerful. A car that produces enormous downforce while remaining stable across every phase of the lap. For a driver like Max Verstappen, that kind of stability is everything. Verstappen is famous for his ability to exploit a predictable aerodynamic platform. When he trusts the car underneath him, he can brake later, accelerate earlier, and carry speed through corners that other drivers simply cannot match. That is why the upgrades revealed before the Chinese Grand Prix created such a reaction inside the paddock. Because if Red Bull has truly stabilized the aerodynamic behavior of the RB22, the car might suddenly become far easier to drive over long race distances. And when a car with massive aerodynamic potential becomes easy to drive, something very dangerous happens for the rest of the grid. Its real performance finally appears. Which leads to the question that several teams quietly began asking after studying the RB22 in Shanghai. What if the car that struggled with tire degradation in Australia was not the real RB22 at all? What if the real version of this machine has only just begun to appear? And this is the moment where the entire story begins to shift. Because after the Chinese Grand Prix weekend, something became very clear to the engineers studying the RB22. The upgrades were not simply about fixing a weakness. They were about revealing a capability that had been hidden inside the car from the very beginning. When Red Bull analyzed the data coming out of Shanghai, the numbers showed a pattern that was completely different from Australia. Rear tire temperatures were more stable. Corner exit traction improved. And most importantly, the aerodynamic balance of the car remained far more consistent during long stints. That consistency is one of the most valuable characteristics a Formula One car can have. Because when the aerodynamic platform behaves predictably, the driver stops fighting the car. And when a driver stops fighting the car, lap time begins to appear almost naturally. Braking becomes more precise. Throttle application becomes earlier. And the tires remain inside their ideal operating window for longer periods. For Max Verstappen, this kind of stability unlocks a completely different level of performance. Verstappen is known across the paddock for his ability to drive on the edge of aerodynamic grip. He can feel when the car is about to lose balance by the smallest margin. But that ability only becomes truly powerful when the car responds the same way every single lap. If the car changes behavior from corner to corner, even the best driver in the world must hold back. And that is exactly what Red Bull appears to have solved with the RB22 upgrades. The floor is now delivering downforce more progressively. The cooling system is stabilizing the airflow toward the rear of the car. And the interaction between the aerodynamic platform and the hybrid power delivery has become smoother. Which means the RB22 no longer behaves like a machine operating on a knife edge. It behaves like a controlled weapon. And that is the part that has made rival engineers nervous. Because once a car reaches that level of aerodynamic stability, development becomes much easier. Engineers can begin pushing other areas of performance. More aggressive setups. More efficient energy deployment. More aerodynamic load. All without risking the unpredictable behavior that appeared earlier in the season. In other words, the RB22 may have just crossed the most difficult stage of its development. Understanding the car. Once a Formula One team truly understands how its machine behaves, progress begins to accelerate. And that is why several engineers in the paddock are quietly saying the same thing after the Chinese Grand Prix. If the upgrades introduced before Shanghai truly solved the stability problem of the RB22, then the rest of the grid may have just witnessed the moment when Red Bull unlocked the real potential of this car. The version that struggled with tire degradation in Australia may only have been the early draft. The unfinished version. And if the aerodynamic concept revealed in China continues evolving over the next races, something very uncomfortable could happen for the rest of the championship.